Far Cry is one of Ubisoft's most popular and one of its biggest franchises ever released. Far Cry has received praise for its stories, gameplay, characters, and more. One of the most popular entries to the series is Far Cry 3, and it featured Voss and the famous line about the definition of insanity.
But the definition of insanity is doing the exact same fucking thing over and over again, expecting shit to change.
In 2021, we saw the release of Far Cry 6, which took players all the way to the Cuban-inspired island nation of Yara. Far Cry has come a long way since its first iteration released in 2004. It certainly made plenty of advancements. But for fans that have stuck with it all these years, Far Cry has always maintained its charm of being an absolutely amazing mess of a video game that's full of chaos and intense combat. Before we really dive into today's topic, if you're new to the channel, be sure to hit the subscribe button with notifications on so you never miss a single upload. Alright, let's get into the evolution of Far Cry from the origins until today. Interestingly enough, Far Cry wasn't always developed by Ubisoft. In fact, the first Far Cry game was developed by a German studio named Crytek. The Cry engine used by Crytek to develop Far Cry was very demanding. In fact, it was the most demanding game engine on the market at the time. Ubisoft eventually struck a deal with Crytek to publish their demo game Exile into a full AAA title. This would eventually become Far Cry, which was actually about a man named Jack Carver, who stumbles upon genetic research done by a man named Dr. Krieger and the Krieger Corporation on a fictional island. The goal of Dr. Krieger was to create powerful Trigen beasts and later sell them to mercenaries. In 2004, Far Cry would release on Windows PC and would sell 730,000 copies in the first 4 months. Critics and fans alike praised Far Cry. Crytek would later go on to work with EA and create the Crysis series, so they were really unable to work with Ubisoft at this point. Ubisoft then decided that they wouldn't lose out on Far Cry, and they acquired all rights to the series and even a perpetual license for the CryEngine version used to develop the Far Cry games then. Since that point, Ubisoft Montreal has been in charge of all future Far Cry game development. A few spin-offs would be released between the first and second Far Cry. Far Cry Instincts was released in 2005 as a port of the original Far Cry to Xbox, but it was much more limited due to hardware limitations on the Xbox. Also, its story was even altered and there were some pretty big changes made, so it's largely just considered an entirely separate title. In 2006, Far Cry Instincts Evolution would be released, which was a sequel of Far Cry Instincts. It would release on Xbox with a new single-player campaign, but it was a bit shorter. In 2006, Far Cry Instincts Predator would also release for the Xbox 360. Far Cry Instincts Predator was a graphically enhanced version of Far Cry Instincts and Far Cry Instincts Evolution. Also in 2006 was Far Cry Vengeance, which was a port of Far Cry Instincts Evolution for the Wii. And then in 2007 we got Paradise Lost, which was a rail shooter arcade game port of Far Cry Instincts. Far Cry 2 would finally release 4 years after the first one in 2008. Developed by Ubisoft Montreal and published for both PC and console, Far Cry 2 would take players all the way to East Africa, where an armed smuggler known as the Jackal is selling weapons to factions engaged in a civil war. Players got to take on the role of a mercenary and hunt down the Jackal. Far Cry 2 was praised quite a lot for its sandbox style of gameplay. Not only did Far Cry 2 put heavy emphasis on realism, it had things like an open savanna, included animals, towns, forests, and even let you get malaria. That's the peak point of Far Cry 2, obviously. Far Cry 2 did get some heat for its realism and writing, but it still sold 3 million copies within 4 months. Then 2012 saw the release of Far Cry 3. Considered the best in the series by many, considered the peak of Far Cry by others, Far Cry 3 gave players the chance to play as Jason Brody, an ordinary American tourist who must learn the ways of the jungle in order to survive, and rescue his friends that have been kidnapped by Voss to be sold into slavery. Far Cry 3 was much more ambitious and much larger than the other titles. Ubisoft went all in on promoting Far Cry 3, and in fact, Far Cry 3 would go on to sell 10 million copies across its lifespan, and was nominated for Game of the Year and Best Shooter. It was praised for its design, visuals, gameplay, and characters. In 2013, we'd see the release of Far Cry Blood Dragon. Basically a major psychotic trip of a Far Cry game, it was inspired intensely by 80s action movies and TV like Terminator, Predator, RoboCop, and more. It shared the same engine and gameplay mechanics as Far Cry 3, but it was a completely separate story. The best way to describe Far Cry Blood Dragon is that the developers were just having a bit of fun. Fast forward to 2014 and we get to Far Cry 4. Originally meant to be a sequel to Far Cry 3, Far Cry 4 eventually became a standalone story about AJ Gale, who gets caught up in a civil war and must overthrow a self-appointed king named Pagan Min in the fictional country of Kiryat in the Himalayas. Why was Gale caught up in this war? He went to travel from the US to Kiryat to spread his mother's ashes, and he ended up fighting a dictator. Isn't that something? Far Cry 4 was actually the biggest launch in Far Cry history, selling 7 million copies by the end of 2014. Considering that it released in November 2014, it only took 2 months to sell that much. However, Far Cry 4 was criticized for its lack of innovation compared to Far Cry 3. Either way though, it was loved by so many. In 2016, Far Cry would get its most unique entry yet in Far Cry Primal. A spin-off of Far Cry 4, Far Cry Primal takes place during the Stone Age. It has players basically start off as an unarmed hunter named Takar, who must become a tribal leader. However, because the game takes place in the Stone Age, weapons were severely limited, leading many critics to point out that it was repetitive at times and just not very innovative. It was certainly a unique idea that has many diehard fans to this day, but overall it just didn't seem to catch on too well with most fans. In 2018, Far Cry 5 came into the picture and gave us one of the craziest Far Cry stories yet. Players control a character named the Deputy who must fight against a doomsday cult named the Project at Eden's Gate, led by a fanatical zealot named Joseph Seed, aka the Father. Far Cry 5 went all in, and much like the other Far Cry games, it just didn't hold back. Although Far Cry 5 was the fastest selling title in the entire franchise, it did receive some criticism for its narrative and characters. Also, the fact that the Deputy can't speak was a pretty big problem for many players. Either way, a lot of people did like Far Cry 5, and its gameplay as well as its soundtrack. Far Cry 5 would receive a sequel in Far Cry New Dawn. Far Cry New Dawn takes place 17 years after one possible ending of Far Cry 5, and had players take on the role of a customizable captain who has survived a nuclear war and fallout. Far Cry New Dawn released in 2019 and included a lot of RPG elements that made it more customizable compared to previous iterations. However, not everybody was a fan of these new RPG additions, and people felt like it wasn't really that much different compared to Far Cry 5, so it just didn't really stick. However, we make it to Far Cry 6 in 2021. Far Cry 6 would be the first Far Cry game to feature ray tracing, and supposedly more advanced features and mechanics compared to other entries in the series. Corresponding well in the timeline of next-gen hardware and consoles, Far Cry 6 was hyped fairly well. Players assumed the role of Danny Rojas, who could either be male or female. The adventure was to overthrow Anton Castillo, and his regime in the island of Yara. The game was obviously inspired by the Cuban Revolution, and brought back a fully voiced protagonist and the tropical setting we know and love from older Far Cry games. Technically, Far Cry 6 still had all of the elements that make Far Cry part of Far Cry, but it still received mixed reviews. Players liked the setting and the visuals and enjoyed Giancarlo Esposito's performance as Anton Castillo, but there seemed to be a major point of criticism towards the lack of innovation and the aging design of Far Cry games. Many felt it was a step down from Far Cry 5, others liked it, and some just outright hated it. Far Cry overall has received lots of praise for its gameplay design, narratives, action, adventure, maps, and innovation. In September 2019, Ubisoft reported that Far Cry had accumulated 50 million total sales. Far Cry was, and still endures, as a very popular first-person shooter franchise. It's chaotic and insane, but also thought-provoking and interesting at times. Some Far Cry games shine above the others, but overall, Far Cry has always had the same consistent charm that makes it so addictive to play every single time. Thanks for tuning into DZSH Gaming. If you enjoyed that video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe with notifications set to all. Check out our website for gaming news, entertainment, and more. The links to everything are in the description below.